Cool. So this is just going to be like getting you guys all situated with all the technical jargon and basic understanding of uh, why we're using this program for this project, and then doing a second drawing program, right? Like, why are we doing a second drawing program? Fundamentally, there are just these two different formats of using digital files to represent images. And I'll not just be covering the raster stuff that we're dealing with Photoshop right now, but also giving you, the other aspect, a little bit of the vector that we will be doing for project 2, just so that we all have, a little bit of understanding as we go along. Continuing. There we go. So yeah, no matter what you really are using for a program, whether it be Photoshop or CAD, or any type of program, 3D modeling software, it's all going to be breaking down into either raster-based graphics or vector, or some combination of the two. This is just giving you a preview. So raster, if you blow it up like this image, you're going to get something pixelized. Whereas in vector, if you take the same resolution image to start with, and it's in a vector format, and you enlarge that, you're going to retain that quality. The reason being is that raster, sometimes also called bitmap, like a bitmap image, is going to be based in pixels, whereas vectors are points on a grid. And as you change the points on a grid with vectors, you're going to be able to evenly scale the image. So I obviously am recording this, but if you guys, have something to jot down notes, that's probably good if you are new to these different areas. So, obviously right off the bat, yeah, you would think, oh, well, why don't we just use vector for everything if we can scale it up evenly? Vector you can't work on in the same way as you can in raster. And so as we go through both projects, it'll become very apparent in how the two programs work and how they vary, and like which program you're going to use for which tasks. And I guess the point of this lecture is to get you situated in that context. And then we'll fill in the gaps on project 2. So here's kind of a preview of what a tiny thumbnail would be if this is the full resolution of a file, and kind of expanded or zoomed in. It's going to be pixelized here. But if we take that image and actually expand it, right, like enlarge it, we would actually see more pixels in this. Expanding the resolution is literally embedding more pixels. I guess this is just giving you an enlargement zoomed in view to just look at these actual individualized pixels, to acknowledge that raster images are based on pixels in a grid. So each of these pixels is given a value of color, and most of the time the color is going to be based in RGB, the color mode. I mean, that's just the highly go-to default for screens is RGB. RGB is, of course, 256 colors of each color, red, green, and blue. The colors start at 0. So it goes from 0 to 255. Might seem overly specific right now, because you don't necessarily need to work with RGB. You could work with, like a color slider or so forth. But once we get into using coding, you have that ability at setting colors more manually. So that'll be more apparent once we get to that point. Continuing here. Just another view of these pixels on a grid, right? And the big things that differ between raster and vector, I thought I had more notes on that. Big things that differ here are that Photoshop, raster-based images, we're really thinking more in the terms of photography, holding up higher resolution within individual pixels. So photorealistic meaning, you take a photo, right? Versus something that's more graphic, like that previous image of the cartoon, right? More graphic, more design oriented. And move this view here. Things to think about for raster stuff is that it really is based on the resolution, and it depends on that resolution to be presented. So you set all those specifications when you start a file. You have the ability of changing those file specifications when you export a file and so forth. They do have a much larger file size than vector in general, because vector-based files are dealing with individual vector points on a grid, and the program more or less needs to store those points. And then everything in between them, like say if you have a color or a gradient, that file isn't storing every single pixel in between. It just stores the points and then knows what to fill in between, right? It's given kind of a script. Raster stuff is literally every single pixel gets saved, right? And not only that point, but as you're working on raster files, you have multiple layers, right? Before you potentially export it into like a flat photo with one layer. All of those layers, every pixel is saved. So as you're compiling more and more data into a file, you're getting much larger file sizes. Kind of like the one big downfall, I suppose, or downside of raster. And my keyboards are not working here. There we go. So just giving you a preview of resolution. As we increase our resolution in pixels, right? 1 pixel wide by 1 pixel tall is just 1 pixel, obviously. But as we move along, you can see we're gaining clarity. More pixels gives you that higher resolution. The terms here that you should be familiarized with are pixels per inch, PPI, and dots per inch, dots, or DPI. And you could really think of these as screen versus print, if you want. Things that are digital versus things that are analog. It's another way to think of it, perhaps. Anything that you're gonna see on the screen is presented as pixels, obviously. Whereas the D is dots. That is not only for like printing, right? Like an inkjet printer would be throwing dots onto a page, right? But also for scanning. I did do a scanning kind of demo for you guys, and I saved that video. I put it on like our assignments section of today on the schedule. So if you guys, I'm really hoping everybody does, you know, generates their own photo or some kind of scan. So depending on what you have access to, I mean, everybody's got a camera, right? But scanner is really fun to play with as well. So if you want more insight on kind of approaches, you can check that video out. That'll help you supplement. What else was I going to say? I kind of rambled off on something. So yeah, I guess getting back to that notion of DPI isn't just for printing, but it's also for scanning. And if you increase the amount of DPI that you're looking at, then you can also translate into a larger PPI, right? Translation from one to another. This is just giving you a sense of like what a DPI could be. The standard for printing, if you were to take a file and send it to a printer, the standard is going to be 300 dots per inch, 300 DPI. Basically, any printer you buy off a store shelf, the standard is going to be 300. You print a document, you know, you have a paper that you wrote, you print that off, it's going to be that for a default. Now, do we need that kind of full clarity on a computer screen? No, because computer screens aren't that high fidelity, at least in the past. You know, different phones like this is like a OLED screen. It's got a higher resolution. A lot of older monitors don't. So the standard for web on a screen is 72 pixels per inch. And usually when you are saving stuff for web, that is a good standard to go by, unless you want to like kind of plan for future changes that the standard might be changing here at some point as more and more people have, you know, a better quality screen. But so 300 pixels across and 300 pixels down translates to 300 DPI. Right, it's just trying to give you some semblance of acknowledging how these files are being compiled, because when you set them up, you're not just setting a total dimension, right? Oh, it's 10 inches wide and 10 inches tall. How dense are the pixels? That's where this sense of DPI, PPI come in. Perhaps like another version of zooming in on different elements. And losing clarity here. This doesn't look like the same image at the bottom. Oh no, yeah, these are all different images. Man, I should do an example where they're like the same image zoomed in. So interpolation is something that you would use if you're being very specific for preserving digital authenticity. So this is going to be in the realm of working with art. Let's see, preservation, you know, digital preservation of like an archive of a file. Like if you're dealing with an artistic photograph, a print, right? What's another example? A slide. Slides are a very big one. It's something that you guys never have had to worry about. When I was first starting in the art world, slides were still a standard. So it wasn't too long ago that they were still being used. So there is still places that have a large, a large collection of slides that maybe that's the only place those files exist, right? For like an artwork. And how do you digitize that? Well, when you are doing any kind of enlargement, that's where interpolation comes in. You have the option of resampling an image, which is turning on interpolation. This sort of resampling is literally taking the whole image and processing it to a new array of pixels. So the authenticity is lost because the pixels have been changed and updated. Some people could argue, oh, well, an image is an image. What does it matter? Well, it's either an image that was taken through the lens of a camera, which is authentic, versus an image that's taken from a camera and then translated through another lens, right, into something else. So if you wanted to preserve the quality while making it larger, you would just keep interpolation off. The image would get larger. It could look a little bit more pixelated, but the point is you're retaining that original quality. So a lot of it has to do with preferences, but it's definitely one of those more technical aspects. Again, I did the scanning demo, so you could check that out if you want. File size is perhaps the area that you guys, one of the few major areas you guys should become, well aware of, like basically become very savvy with file sizes and how to manage them and why you might need a big file size for something versus a small. So not only for each individual work, but also in a sense of archiving stuff as you go along, So, when you're 56 years old, are you going to have all this data that you have right now? Right? You take photos on your phone. Are you going to have all those? You created these images that you might use for your portfolio. Are you going to need those when you're 56? In what capacity? Do you want them to be a larger file size so they retain quality? There's all these different layers, and it's like as you go along, you're going to really it's going to become apparent, if it hasn't already, that you really don't need to save larger files than you really need, depending on what it is you're using it for. And I guess a lot of you who have like newer computers, newer laptops that have solid state drives probably already have tasted this fully, how you run out of storage really quick. So being savvy is going to be helpful. So this is just a brief overview of file sizes as they've increased from each new model of like the iPhone, as just a general reference point. None of these are to scale, these boxes. It's just showing you they're getting larger. If the largest one is like iPhone 10 from a few years ago, the smallest is the first iPhone, right? 1600 by 1200. What does 320 by 480 represent? Anybody know? this is really commonly known and should be known if you're working with video in any capacity, like what 320 by 480 would mean. Huh. Nobody in my other class knew, which is like, all right. But then now a total of 40 people total.
Is that considered standard definition?
That is what it is. Yep. Thanks for saving the day. All hope is not lost. This is like the original resolution you'd have on televisions, like CRT tube TVs, for example, right? Like before HD cable. So like VHS tapes, some DVDs, depending on your output. Yeah. And obviously these are not to scale, but just comparing the two numbers, that's a crazy contrast, right? To think like the original iPhone, which is really crappy images, you know, was comparing to like old TV. So aside from that, does anybody have an idea why the file size, the generalized file size for a photo on an iPhone around 6 to an iPhone 8, right, which is like only a couple of years apart, would jump from like 3 megs to 20 megs? What's changed there? What are some things that might be increasing that file size? There's a lot of them.
Post-processing work. I know they added a lot more sensors, like the LiDAR that they threw in there. They're using multiple cameras. I think they take multiple photos at once as well, and then overlay them all together to like use AI to like figure out the best one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wanted to be specific. You kind of already mentioned it. Like my other class, somebody's like, well, they have multiple cameras. Well, it's not just the fact that they have multiple cameras that's making the file size larger. It's how they're using those cameras, right? And yeah, to your point, they are taking simultaneous photos with them. And then, yeah, there is software that is going through and determining which pixels to be putting in place. But if that's the case, then all the other pixels that are not being used wouldn't they be thrown away or not? Because if they're thrown away, then that's really just one image. So the point is that they're not always getting thrown away. You could still go into those photos and edit them and play between, multiple cameras, different lighting. So yeah, the general term for all of this is metadata. All of these photos have a great more depth and range of metadata that's accessible. So things like, back around the iPhone 3 or 4 period, being able to have GPS location on a photo. That was never done before. That takes up file size. Live photos, the sense of like adding a little video clip to your photo, HDR, right? Color range. How deep is that color depth? So yeah, adding all this stuff bogs it down, and we might only see a photo in the end, but that like deeper ability is what's doing all this, and kind of makes you think down to that question, like, well, do I need all that stuff or not? So being able to be more aware of how you're managing the data, I guess, is the point here we're trying to focus on. And speaking of managing data, this is really the heavy hitting component with images is, aside from the overall dimensions and the pixel density, you also are talking about compression. So compression is anytime you take an original image and reduce its file size to some capacity. And the term for that would be lossy. You take an image and crunch it down in some way, that image transforms from a lossless image into a lossy image. So we have the capability of exporting files that retain full pixel clarity that we start with. You could do that. You could do it in a TIFF, a PNG, a PDF, this Windows format. And then any of these purple, you have the option. Either you want full clarity, or you want it fully compressed, or do you want it somewhere in between, right? Things to note here are that the PNG standard is really popular for its use of transparency, the option of having transparency. And it's got pretty wide acceptance for using that file format everywhere. JPEG obviously is the most common because it has a very small footprint in file size due to its compression. And you'll see that pretty much everywhere online. And because of that, it's got the most widely accepted, format, JPEG, accepted for most applications that use images. It does not support transparency. So you probably will end up using PNGs towards the end of the semester if you are using transparent images for coding. And what else did I want to note? PDFs are basically the standard, right? For like communication these days, you could put anything in them for the most part. TIFF is very similar to a PDF. TIFF is really what you will find more often when you're dealing with printers, publishing, printing, any kinds of facilities like that. A lot of times those different printers and different hardware to do printing, like a stitching machine or something, they generally, usually, in my experience, if they're going to only support one file size to take an image to then export into a specific, like stitch file, for example, they will take a TIFF more often than not. It just depends. The cheaper software obviously is more restricted than something like Photoshop, where there's endless options, but it also costs a bunch of money. Also, the GIF format. Some people like to say GIF. There's a battle, the endless battle for the GIF name. Also has very wide support because of its age, and it does allow animations within it. Anybody have questions on file compression or formats? So then we get into color. For those of you who have never heard this before, it's pretty interesting. If you were to go really up close to a screen, probably not the screen you have right now because it's probably a better screen than in the past, but if you were to go up to like a tube TV, you look really close at it, you'll be able to see the individual diodes of color. And if you had white on the screen, you went really close, you would literally see red, green, and blue little diodes all illuminated. So all three of those colors create white. We as humans perceive this. I mean, most beings perceive all of these colors of light as white. Whereas this other kind of more counterintuitive naming convention of subtractive color mixing like paints, or in this case, ink, right? If we combine cyan, magenta, and yellow, we get black. So this is literally CMYK. That's the color standard for printing. The most accepted color printing color mode. So again, when we're in programs, it just depends on what color mode we're working in. So if we know we are going to be working specifically for printing, we'd probably want to just give ourselves that perhaps slightly better edge at looking at the more end product of color by using CMYK color space. But if we're working for web or computer screens explicitly, you'd probably want to choose RGB. And obviously you can translate from one to the other, but if your screen's well calibrated, or at least somewhat, it could be perceivably close to be using CMYK for printing. But then the other thing I always like to mention is that if you ever do any sort of design work, say you're going to do a logo or something, where there's going to be like a large outreach or a large, you need a versatility with said digital file. You want to also be thinking of like, how is this going to look without color? And a big example is like if you took a logo with overlapping colors and you printed that logo, but that printer is only black and white printer, how is that going to look? Is it going to retain the contrast that you would hope it would, right? So pretty interestingly, if you guys took a bright red and like a gray or black or something like that, and you convert it to grayscale, it's going to show up pretty close to the same color. It's kind of weird. Similarly with like yellow and the cyan, right? Shows you that they're pretty similar looking. So it's always helpful when you're doing some kind of more complex campaign, if you will, of design. Continuing on with color, we have the breakdown of how many bits per channel are we dealing with. And this is just in relation to how much color, how many colors possible are we dealing with. And for all of our basic monitors, for basic printing, we're not going to need more than 8. Once we get into like upholding higher fidelity to like, like an OLED screen or 4K video, right? We are then wanting to have that higher clarity. Like if you take a nice resolution photo with a DSLR camera, you edit it well on a good monitor, and you want to print it at a larger scale with a professional firm to have like a nice color image on the wall, you're going to be wanting at least the 16-bit, probably the 32, depending on the caliber and the cost and all these different factors, right? But as you increase the bit size, you're also compounding the file size of the whole image because there's more data to be stored. So yeah, again, we're just always going to be dealing with 8. This new document window is different now. So we can cover it here in a moment. But in general, no matter what preference you click on, you always have the option to go manual. So I'll cover the expectations for you guys. If you haven't formally, started your Photoshop file, we can cover that. And if anybody has questions on like converting, so like say you started, but you want to change the size, there's an option for that as well. Making adjustments. I put this on here in terms of printing, because in this class we used to do printing in the classroom. I used to put stuff in the wall, put stuff in the hallway on the walls. So you might have seen that if you've been around. This is kind of more in just relation to the fact that color is very complex, from transferring from one medium to another. Since we're dealing with something digital, right? We're looking at it on a screen with light, to transfer in another color mode to be printed. There's a lot going on there. And if everything's not calibrated to a T, if you're not using all of the specific calibrated color formats and so forth, things aren't going to come out exactly how you perceive them on the screen. So in that regard, generally, the way to go about solving that would be to just change your color tones and so forth, as your image as a whole, right? And so you make a test print, you see how it comes out, you make some adjustments, you print again. That's like the DIY way about it. So, you know, now that we're learning Photoshop, you guys should have that ability at least to do the bare bones end. I myself have never gotten into complex color or, you know, managing, I just said it a second ago, not color spaces, but like formatting printers and so forth. Anytime I need something printed like that, I go to professionals that have their printers already adjusted and set, right? I don't own any of that hardware. If I did, I probably would have it more set up to my needs, but I usually just go to professionals. They say what they can take. I make sure my file is set to that, and then they make any adjustments they need. But I'll also cover, all right, I already covered exporting, right? Last class. Nice. How to export a PDF, changing it from a high quality to like a proof preset. That's all I really am looking for. I also covered save for web, right? And we're not covering printing. So that's it. Any questions? All I'm gonna do at this point is go into like setting up a document. But does anybody else have any questions up to that? Okay, let's continue. So if I, let's close this. Make a new file, right, in Photoshop. So if you guys haven't made your file, you can go ahead and just open it up now, and we'll build one up together so you're not lost or do something wrong. If you've already started, you'll also want to check your file information. I can show you how to do that in a second. So if you haven't started yet, you just go to new. The quickest way would be to go to print and tabloid, because even though we are not printing this semester, obviously, we can still set the file to be printable in a little bit larger format so that should you want to print it later, you have the option. If there is anybody in here that is pretty savvy with Photoshop and they're hoping to use this assignment to make a really, really well-rounded like image for portfolio, for example, and you want to make it larger, potentially to print at a large scale, you could go larger. So for example, when I was an undergrad, our largest printer page was, or roll of paper was 4 feet wide. So you know, you could do 4 feet wide by 6 feet, 12 feet long. I don't care what you do. It's going to take a lot more file size, a lot more, right? So if you really don't know if you're going to, probably just stick with the tabloid. I also like to cover here just briefly that some printers do not have that capability of printing all the way to the edge of a piece of paper, right? So, and this is just for your all of your understanding, right? Because when you're dealing with, say, a painting or a professional, like a not professional, traditional print, like printmaking, anything like these, you generally want to display the entire image, right? You don't want to like mask off part of that drawing. You want to present it. That's why a lot of times you'll see paintings like around the edge of the canvas. So as to like present the entire image. So you'd kind of want to have that same authenticity, I guess, right? When you have a digital file, you don't want to be cutting off the edges of a digital file. Just like when you print a document, you want to be able to read all the words, right? So if we just hypothetically, if we were to print on a tabloid sized piece of paper, which for those of you who aren't aware, um, a legal is, or sorry, a letter is 8.5 by 11 inches, right? This is a letter size sheet of paper. The tabloid is literally, if you just take the sheet of paper and you turn it sideways and you add a second sheet, that's 11 by 17. So it's just a standard. I would argue it's probably the second most common sheet of paper size that you would see. Like the library should have it and so forth. So basically meaning that a lot of printers you get that have some capabilities are going to have the option for tabloid, but might not have it larger than that, right? So if, back to this hypothetical thing, if we have that as our resolution for the page size, right, 11 inches wide by 17 tall, if we make our document size exactly the same dimensions, that would mean we're printing all the way to the edge of the paper. But some printers, like the one we have in DMS, don't print all the way to the edge of the paper. If you wanted to have the full printing like that possible, that would be considered to be full bleed, where you're kind of accounting for printing beyond the edge of the paper, and you actually do waste some ink in that process. But the whole point with that would be then there's no white edge. It's, you don't have to cut the white off or anything like that. So if we were to save this or, create this file like this and then print it to tabloid, we could still shrink our image down so that it fits within the printable area, right? We could do that. That does, in a sense, somewhat take away that authenticity, right? It's not the full image size. So if we wanted 100% of our scale to be printed, we might end up doing like 10.5 by 16.5, which is like a quarter of an inch around the whole side to account for that white space that doesn't get printed. Kind of technical, but it is worth noting because once you do ever get into some kind of printing, these things do come up. So if you don't care exactly what the dimensions are, I would just pick tabloid and then either choose, if you're doing, portrait or landscape, it just toggles the two between. If you decide, you know what, I want to do, I want it to be portrait, right? So this could be like 17. Your width could be smaller. So the smallest that I would want you guys to do would be probably like 9 inches, something like that. Because then, I don't know, I could say like 8.5 if you really wanted to. The point here is like it's going to be larger than a sheet of paper, and we're utilizing most of that page in theory, this page that we're not printing to. And then just stick with RGB color profile, and that's really all we have to worry about. So see, if you wanted like a more of a narrow page, that's how you could approach that. So from this point on, if you guys have already started a document, right, and say, I just throw these things on the page here so you guys can see what I mean. Say if you made this document, you're like, ooh, wait a second, I didn't want it to be this narrow. I need to make it larger. There's two different adjustments to like the size that we can deal with in Photoshop. And it's kind of important you guys know what both of them do. You might not even use them, but like as media makers, you should be aware of how to do this, because you'll need to do this over the course of your career a lot, if you're dealing with images in any capacity. So the first one is image size, and the second is canvas size. Well, if I wanted to like make this actual width of the image larger, that's where I would do the canvas size. And I could change that here to say 11, right? And then when I hit OK, you'll see that it actually did expand the canvas. So it's not touching the art. It's literally just making the canvas larger, like our surface larger. It doesn't touch the art, the image. Whereas if I were to do the image size and I wanted to do a larger, amount of pixels, say I want this to be 5,000 pixels wide. And if you could lock the resolution so it also adjusts the height, so 5,000 pixels wide, hit OK. It scales the entire image up. And that's where you, in the image size, that's where you have that option for the resample or not. See how if I change this from 8.5 by 17, if I change this to like 11 like I did before, also increases the height. The resolution goes down. Why does it go down? Because I'm not resampling. Right? It's kind of dragging out these pixels. It's like the universe expanding. Anybody have questions? I feel like I'm on rapid fire and everybody's sleepy. Probably just because I'm on rapid fire. There's got to be some questions. Who's anybody confused with making their file or adjusting their file or anything like that? Is anybody stuck on like why the resolution matters? Like we have the width and the height, right? In like inches, what is the resolution? Is anybody stuck on that? Like, this is the time to figure it out if you are.
I was gonna ask, do we have to have it on portrait mode for our project, or can we have it on horizontal?
Horizontal's fine.
All right.
What's the smallest size you want us to have our canvas to be?
Like 8.5. I think that's what this is.
Okay.
Yeah, because then that's double as wide as it is tall, kind of thing. It's like 2 squares. But yeah, so if you, I really will mention again, if you do hope to do a really, really impressive image that you will end up printing at some point, I have the contact for the art department who, they have all of these printers there. It's very cheap to get things printed there. In contrast, so it might cost like $20 to $30 for like a 4-foot by 6-foot print or something. It's pretty huge, right? It covers like a whole wall. Versus if you got that printed at like a FedEx or some local, place like that, it'd be over $100. So very good quality and such. So if you, want to have that option, totally could do a larger file size. So yeah, if nobody's got questions, we're just going to open it up to work session today. First thing I want to do is, I know there's a bunch of people in this class that joined late. So I'll probably be willing to work with you guys on like extending some of the deadlines perhaps, right? Because you are, starting later. Not by a ton, just to maybe help you out a little bit so you're not stressing. But aside from that, I want to make sure first now today that we have everybody like good with their concept and their visual approach. Like they've got through, their statement, they got through sketches, they know how they're approaching it. Is anybody stuck with that specifically? Any of those 2 pieces? And I mean, if anybody's ever during the class, like if anybody ever feels like I'm putting you on the spot or something, oh, and I can stop this recording.